What we are doing here is doing a review of Lewis structures, how to write a Lewis structure and how to do resonance structures. So, a Lewis structure is a representation of the covalent molecules, and what it does, it shows all the electrons, the bonding and the non-bonding. Lewis structures are incredibly useful, so it is important to know how to write a correct Lewis structure. Let's use an example of phosphorus trichloride. First thing to do is to find the sum of all the valence electrons of all the atoms in the ion or molecule. Now if it's a molecule, then you just count up the electrons. If it's an anion, then you're going to add an electron for each negative charge, and if it's a cation, you'll subtract for each missing electron. So for PCl3, we have 5 valence electrons for phosphorus, and there are 3 chlorine atoms. Each one has 7 valence electrons, so we have a total of 26. And in general, I like to work with pairs, so that would be 13 pairs. Okay, the second step is to write the skeleton. And there aren't any hard and fast rules on how to write a skeleton, but in general, the central atom is the least electronegative element that isn't hydrogen. And once we write the skeleton, we connect the outer atoms with single bonds. And if we're keeping track of electrons, we have used 6 electrons, 2 for each of the 3 bonds. So now we have 20 left. The next step is to fill the octets of the outer atoms. So we have 3 chlorine atoms. Each one's going to have an octet, adding 3 lone pairs to each. And we're keeping track of the electrons. We've used 6 electrons from the bonds. We've used 18 electrons from the lone pairs, and now there are 2 remaining. Alright, the next step is to add any leftover lone pairs to the central atom. So we have 2 electrons left over, it's 1 lone pair. We add it to the central atom, and we have used all of our 26 electrons. The last step is to check for octets, and you always want to do this because the biggest mistake people make is to not have proper octets on the atoms that need them. So if you look at this, all the atoms have an octet. The phosphorus has an octet with 3 bonds and 1 lone pair. Each of the chlorines has an octet with 3 lone pairs and 1 bond. Okay, let's look at another example. This has multiple bonds. Now, first step again is to count the valence electrons. So there's 1 from the hydrogen, 4 from the carbon, 5 from the nitrogen, which gives us 10. Next, we create the skeleton and we add octets to the outer atoms. And remember that hydrogen never ever gets an octet. It only gets 1 bond. So we've done that. We have 3 lone pairs around nitrogen, and that's our structure. Next thing is to check for octets. But carbon doesn't have an octet. So what do we do if a central atom doesn't have an octet? We form multiple bonds. And what we'll be doing is we'll be moving electrons from the lone pairs of the nitrogen into bonds between the carbon and the nitrogen. And remember, hydrogen never has more than 1 bond. It never has any lone pairs on it. So we're moving 2 electron pairs from the nitrogen, and we have the structure there in the bottom right where we have a triple bond between the carbon and the nitrogen. Okay, now some molecules can have more than 1 valid Lewis structure. And remember, in this case, the skeleton is the same. We're not moving atoms, we are only moving electrons. So it is only the number of bonds that get changed. Let's look at an example of ozone. So we've drawn a Lewis structure, a valid Lewis structure. Each of the oxygens has an octet, and there are a total of 18 valence electrons. Okay, there is 1 single bond and 1 double bond in ozone. Now, remember that double bonds are shorter and stronger than single bonds. If this were the structure of ozone, it would have to have one shorter, stronger bond and one weaker, longer one. But this isn't the true observed structure of ozone. Both of the oxygen-oxygen bonds are the same length and the same strength. Also, each of the outer oxygens has a charge of -1/2. Notice the formal charge, the way it's written with one double bond and one single bond. We've got a formal charge of 0 on the left oxygen and a formal charge of -1 on the right. So one Lewis structure can't accurately depict a molecule like ozone. And what we do, we use multiple structures. And the multiple structures, they're called resonance structures, and we depict it with a double-headed arrow, as you can see in between here, and that describes the molecule. Remember that resonance structures are not actual bonding depictions. So just as we can make green from mixing blue and yellow, ozone would be a synthesis of or a hybrid of the two resonance structures. It'd be something in between. These electrons in those, what we've written as two double bonds, can actually move between all three oxygens. They're delocalized. Localized means something is stuck in one place. So the electrons would be stuck between the two oxygens. And with a single bond, we consider that the electrons are localized. But when we have resonance structures, they're delocalized, meaning they're not stuck in one place. And so we often write it as something that looks like this on the right, where we have the delocalized electrons are sort of like a half of a double bond. And it's showing the delocalized nature of the bond. So instead of writing two of these here, we would write this. Now, for anything that I require of you in class, you would be writing this structure. So you'd be writing it as full double bond, and you'd show both resonance structures, knowing that this is a better depiction of what the bonds actually look like. Benzene is often used as an example of resonance in delocalization. So there are two resonance structures with benzene. They look like this. Sometimes it's written like this with the bond line formulas, and showing that it isn't this or this, but something that's in between. Benzene is often shown like this as a hexagon with a circle in the center, and that signifies the delocalized electrons.